Gramex lets you use browser caching controls using the HTTP header called cache control. The way it works is you can specify in any handler or microservice a header called cache control and pass it a set of parameters that define how the browser is to respond to caching or how it's supposed to cache the content. So every microservice can be cached, and putting something like max age equals 3600 tells the browser to by default cache things for 1 hour, which is 3600 seconds. Let's try this out. On the IDE, we can pick any microservice. We already have a default file handler that serves index.html, and the output of that is welcome to Gramex. If I look at the HTTP headers, there's no mention of cache control here. That's because we haven't set it up. And by default, if I make a change, let's say I change this to welcome to Gramex 2 and copy this and open it in a new window, it says welcome to Gramex 2. The change is reflected. And of course, if I reload this page, the change is reflected as well. Now, let's do this. We are going to add a header. I'm going to copy from here, cache control, max age 3600. Well, let's not have 3600. Let's just have 36 seconds. And we'll save this. Now, if I reload this page, you'll see that the max age is 36 seconds. So it caches it. And if I change this to, let's say, 3 and open it in a new window, it still says Gramex 2. Open it in a new window, it still says Gramex 2. I have to wait for 36 seconds before it goes to the browser. So before the browser goes to the server and fetches a result again, which has Gramex 3. Or I could right click on the reload, and that will allow me to do a hard reload, or I could press Control Shift R. Any of those are valid options. If I right click on this, I can choose between normal reload, hard reload, and empty cache and hard reload. Or I could disable the cache in the network tools and reload, in which case it will always fetch it from the source again. So this is one way you can use caching to specify how long something should be stored in the browser. There are several other options you can pass to cache control. You can explicitly say cache control : no store. What that means is the browser will never store the results. It will always go back to the server. No cache means always check with the server. It is allowed to store the result. So if it will check with the server, ask, has the result changed? If the result has changed, it will fetch the new data. If the result has not changed, it will serve the stored or the downloaded response. Private tells the proxies in between whether to cache it or not to cache it. Specifically, private says cache it only on the browser. Don't cache it in a proxy in between. Supposing you're using a load balancer, supposing you're using a reverse proxy, supposing you're using a firewall. All of these are examples of proxies. And if something is private, that is, it contains information only meant for the end user, then you should mark it as private. If you explicitly want to mark it as public, then what you're telling the intermediate servers is this information is not secret. This information is the same for all users, so you can cache it publicly. And even if there's an error, it's okay to cache it. How do we use this? Here are some typical combinations. If you have an external library, let's say a JavaScript library that is versioned and is not going to change, then you can cache it publicly for 10 years. And what you do is cache control : in quotes, public, max age 3156 315360000. That's 10 years in seconds. What this means is that unless you explicitly do a hard reload on the browser, it will always get cached. If it is going through a load balancer, then the load balancer will permanently cache it, and there's pretty much no way you can actually change the underlying data because the proxy or the load balancer in between has already cached it. Use this only if you're very sure that that particular file will always have that content and never change. Static files are files you typically cache publicly for a day. So these could be, let's say, pieces of JavaScript or style sheets that you're writing. And even if they change, they probably could change only once a day. In that case, you say cache control public with max age of a day in seconds. If you have a shared dashboard, that is a dashboard that looks exactly the same for all users, then you probably want to cache it for something like an hour. The data doesn't change too often. So if the person requests a page, then it calculates it and renders a dashboard. But if they request it again or somebody else requests it again within, let's say, a minute or two, and the data is not likely to change, then it can wait for 3600 seconds before caching it. Typically, you'd serve this behind a load balancer. So the load balancer will necessarily cache the page, and there's almost no way of actually forcing it to get the raw content. It is possible, but it's generally hard. If it's a user dashboard, then you can cache it, but cache privately, because different users, when they request the same page, may see different results. So in that case, you say cache control private for an hour. And this means that the browser that the user is using it'll cache it, but it will not be cached in the proxy servers in between. If you have a real-time page, something that even for the user will be constantly refreshed, then you just never want to cache this page. What you put in there is no cache and no store. Telling the browsers, the proxies, just always ask me every time and don't store it, because there's no point storing it. The data is going to be different every time. Now, if you want to reload without using the cache, then press Ctrl F5 on your browser. Here's a broad guideline on when to use what kind of cache response. Supposing your response is not reusable at all, that is, if the response that you send is immediately invalid, after that, even no matter who requests it again, it's not the same. An example would be a random number generator or something that shows the current time. There's no point caching that. So in that case, you say cache control, no store. If it's something that can be reused, but you need to check, let's say you run a query. Maybe the query's response has changed, maybe it hasn't. We want to check with the server. In that case, you want to revalidate. And if you want to check every time, you use no cache. This is something that you'd use for a flight status, for example. Has a flight taken off? Yes or no? The response can be reused, but it's not as if you can be sure that the response will stay the same. So you'd want to check every time. What about if the response doesn't need to be revalidated every time? Then you can store it in the intermediate caches, maybe, but that is only if it's public. If the information is private, you don't want the intermediate cache to store it, because if it's stored in the intermediate cache, then other users will get the same information. So put in private if you can't, if you don't want to store it in the intermediate cache, put it public if you want to store it in the intermediate cache. Also, do you want to cache it for a certain lifetime? Do you want to say, I want to keep it for a certain duration, let's say 100 seconds, then put in max age equals 100. That is the structure for browser cache controls.